Thank you, Julian. Could we have the lights down, please? Rome has often been called the Eternal City, and today what I want to do is give you an overview of why that title seems particularly appropriate, and also to convey to you the notion that Rome is not just a city, but rather a concept that could be adapted and modified by a wide variety of groups over the course of the last 3 millennia. And it's 3 millennia that I'm going to take you through in the course of a rather short period of time, only about 40 minutes. We'll go from the foundation of Rome all the way to the 20th century. But before we get there, what am I showing you on the screen? Good for you! Do you know how many times I show this to my students and they just look at me dumbfounded? So thank you for recognizing that. Obviously, when Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn walked through the streets of Rome, they experienced an excitement that was almost off the charts, and that's where I hope to take you today, showing you some of the same monuments that Gregory Peck showed Audrey Hepburn 60 years ago. Let's start with the origins of Rome, or what the Romans believed were the origins of their city. They traced the foundation of the city to today, April 21st, 753 BC. So they believed that in the middle of the 8th century BC, 2 men, Romulus and Remus, had attempted to found the city. So throughout Rome's history, they would always fixate on that particular date. The circumstances of the founding were as follows. Rhea Silvia, whom you see here almost asleep, was a Vestal virgin. And she was, depending upon the version you read, seduced by or raped by the god Mars, whom you see coming down from Olympus here, and then gave birth to twin sons, Romulus and Remus. And the king of their area, of their town, which at this point was called Alba Longa, so near Rome but not at Rome, was furious that the Vestal Virgin's chastity had been compromised. And so those twin sons, still infants, were put in a basket into the Tiber River. So the same sort of history we hear about with the biblical Moses. And they were then rescued. They were pushed up by the river onto the banks of what would become the city of Rome. So very close to the so-called Tiber Island, where they were nurtured by a friendly she-wolf, which meant that the wolf was always a sacred animal in Roman legend, and then found by a friendly shepherd. In all these heroic stories, there's always a friendly shepherd walking through the woods who raised them to adulthood. And then there was a competition between the brothers to see who would be the founder of Rome, who would plow the outlines of the city. And Romulus was judged the winner of this contest. And in most versions, Remus is killed in the course of this conflict. And then the city that's ultimately founded is named after the winner, Roma, after Romulus, rather than Rima, which is presumably what it would have been named had Remus been the winner. And so Romulus was viewed as the first of a series of 7 kings who controlled the city of Rome between the middle of the 8th century BC and the late 6th century BC. So for about 250 years, Rome is a kingdom. And they would always refer to the 7 kings of Rome, linked to the 7 hills of Rome. And as we go through the history of Rome, I suppose in a sense we can divide it into 4 periods. Royal Rome, or Rome of the 7 kings, from roughly 750 to 500. Then Republican Rome, from 500 to the end of the 1st century BC. Imperial Rome, 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries AD. And then Rome goes east and becomes the Byzantine Empire from the 4th century until the AD until the 15th century AD. And I'll try to highlight the most important components of that history as we go through it. When the late 6th century, around 509 begins, we find Rome under the control of the last of its 7 kings, an Etruscan king. So a king who is associated with north-central Italy. We have a large Etruscan exhibit, of course, upstairs where you can learn more about this civilization. And there's yet another conflict. This is 509 BC. And the last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, is thrown out of the city, and then begins the Roman Republic, which is going to last for another 500 years. And the first big monument of the Republic would always be the most important temple in Roman civilization, the so-called Capitoline Temple, because it's on the Capitoline Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills, and it would be dedicated to what we call the Capitoline Triad, 3 gods. Jupiter in his capacity as Optimus Maximus, Jupiter the best and the greatest, as well as his wife Juno and his daughter Minerva. Those 3 would be worshipped as a triad throughout the subsequent history of Rome. And this temple, which is the first one to be built after the last king is thrown out of the city and the Republic is ushered in, always comes to stand as a symbol for Republican Rome. The decoration of that temple would have been primarily wooden and terracotta. So the upper section of the temple would have been decorated with revetments, with architectural decoration that looks more or less like this. And all of these you'll see in the Etruscan gallery upstairs. So when you're perusing the architectural terracottas in the Etruscan gallery, you can think of what you see there as being representative of what the Romans would have made for their first Republican temple. By about 300 BC, the Romans acknowledge their Trojan ancestry. And so they start publicizing the fact that they derive from the Trojans who left the city of Troy immediately prior to its destruction and made their way through the Mediterranean, ultimately to central Italy. So they trace their descent from Aeneas, A-E-N-E-A-S, whom you see on this coin, actually from the Mint of Troy. And I'm showing you an aerial view of the Mound of Troy here, and then on the map here in northwestern Turkey, in what is now northwestern Turkey. So in tracing their descent from the Trojan hero Aeneas, the Romans were automatically tracing their descent from Aphrodite, who was the mother of Aeneas, with Anchises the father. And Anchises is the older gentleman who's usually carried on Aeneas' back as he leaves the burning city of Rome. So carrying his father on his back and holding his son by the hand. This meant that Aphrodite, or Venus in Latin, was always going to be one of the primary gods of the Roman state, along with Mars, because Mars is the father of Romulus and Remus. So in other words, you have Venus as the mother of Aeneas, and thus the matriarch of the Roman people, and Mars as the father of Romulus, the first king of Rome and the founder of Rome. So Mars and Venus, or Jupiter and Aphrodite, Ares and Aphrodite, are always going to be regarded as the 2 most important deities of Rome. And this Trojan ancestry will become more and more important as time goes on, in part because many of the people that Rome was fighting claimed Greek ancestry. And so in a sense, you have the Trojan War fought all over again, with the Trojans giving rise to the Romans and the Greeks giving rise to the kingdoms of Epirus, the area now occupied by Albania and northwestern Greece. In the course of the Republic, Rome gradually assumes control of the entire Mediterranean. In the 5th and 4th centuries, they're really just focused on central Italy. But in the course of the 3rd century, we get the so-called Punic Wars, the wars with Carthage, the area now occupied by Tunisia. And in the course of the 3rd century, Rome will move into southern Italy, often called Magna Graecia or Great Greece, into Sicily, and then into North Africa. This is when, in the late 3rd century, they will come face to face with the armies of Hannibal and with elephants that are marching as part of the forces that actually march into northern Italy and threaten the Romans here and here. So Roman legend, Roman histories are filled with the terror, stories of the terror that the Romans experienced when they saw Hannibal's armies with elephants marching alongside. They'd never seen anything like this before, at least not in the Italian peninsula. So this is what Rome looks like, this area controlled by Rome as of the end of the 3rd century. And then in the 2nd century BC, Greece and Western Asia Minor also come under the control of Rome. So that by the end of the Roman Republic, the entire Mediterranean basin is essentially controlled by Rome. And all of these conquering generals, So moving off to southern Italy or to North Africa or to Greece or to Western Asia Minor are coming back with a lot of money. Because if you were the conquering general, you got to keep a great deal of what you had taken from the cities, very wealthy cities, which they had sacked. And so there tended to be a system of aristocratic competition that developed, where each general who came back to Rome would build a temple symbolic or connected to the triumph that he had just overseen. And each temple, the triumphator, the general, would try to make each of his temples more grandiose, more elaborate than the other temples that his competitors were building. So a kind of general's aristocratic competition. And so we start getting marble temples in Rome as of the 2nd century BC. Initially, they were all limestone because there were no marble supplies in Italy that were known. That wouldn't happen until the mid-1st century BC. But the competition became so fierce in the 2nd century BC among all these conquering generals that they go all the way to Greece and Asia Minor and import the marble back to Rome and build temples that look like this. You're seeing an overview of the so-called Temple of Hercules Victor here, and then an enlargement here. This is one of the few of these triumphant temples from the Republic that's still standing, dating to the late 2nd century BC, and all built of Greek marble. In fact, even the metrology of the blocks, the measurements of the blocks, correspond to the metrology that the architects in Greece were using at the same time. Now, with all of these monuments that the conquering generals are bringing back, and they're pulling wagons filled to the brim with marble and bronze statues of the gods, of the heroes that had been erected in the cities that they had just conquered, they're taking those statues, parading them through the streets of Rome in triumphal processions, and then setting them up near the temples that they had built with the money that they had pulled from the conquered regions. And so suddenly Rome is flooded with Greek art, with statues from southern Italy, from Sicily, from North Africa, from Greece, and from Asia Minor. So they're pulling in all the monuments, the most elaborate monuments that they can find in the cities that they sack, and putting them on public display. Since these images from Greek regions were characterized by strong musculature, eternal youth, idealized faces, then the images of the conquering generals had to be something that looked different than that. And so we start finding the applications of age applied to the faces of the conquering generals, used as a distinguishing factor. So you'd be able to tell who was the noble Roman, marked by high moral standards, and who was the Greek. More often than not, the Romans would be clad in togas or military garb, whereas the Greeks would be in heroic nudity. And you start seeing this on the coins as well, with prominent crow's feet around the eyes and prominent lines on the face. And if you do that, of course, if you adopt an aged portrait type for the images of your triumphators, your conquering generals, and yet you want to emphasize their martial prowess, their strength on the battlefield, you end up with something like this, where the portrait looks like a man in his 50s or 60s or even 70s, and the body looks like a man in his 20s, because you have to satisfy these two components of your imagery, martial prowess and moral probity. And so they do that by sewing together a youthful body with an aged head. This sort of thing would have been abhorrent to the Greeks, and it's going to die out by the end of the Republic. By the end of the Republic, we get a series of triumvirates. So 3 men banding together to essentially divide what had already become an empire. So even though Rome is nominally a republic in the 1st century BC, in fact it's an empire because it's a small group of men who control it. And we have 2 of these triumvirates, or groups of 3 men. The first triumvirate, where Caesar and Pompey are characters in the alliance, and the second triumvirate, where Octavian, later named Augustus, is in alliance with Mark Antony, whom you all know because of his affair with Cleopatra. And Augustus and Mark Antony will have a major battle at the site of Actium in 31 BC, where Antony's forces, which had been allied with those of Cleopatra, are defeated. And that essentially means that Octavian, later to be named Augustus, would be the sole ruler of the Roman world. And we usually use that battle as our dividing line between the Republic and the Empire. So the Roman Empire, in most of our writing, begins in 31 BC, so the end of the 1st century BC. And you can see the difference in representation of Augustus by comparison with those aged Republican generals that I just showed you. Whereas before there had been a kind of retrospective focus in imagery, that's now changed to a decidedly prospective focus. And so everyone looks young and idealized and perfect, no matter how old they are. So Augustus, this statue was made right after his death when he was in his mid-70s. And you see what he looks like. Portraits always lie. People always forget this. Portraits don't tell the truth. They present what it is that the person sponsoring the portrait wants the portrait to do or say or convey. And the portraits of Augustus are no exception. Augustus traced his ancestry to the Julian family. That means to the family of Aeneas. That means that he could claim Venus as his divine matriarch, the divine matriarch of his family tree. And so you'll notice this little Cupid figure here, who was another child of Venus. And Cupid has his arms in a mirror image of the arms of Augustus. It's another way of indicating the link between the two and the divine ancestry to which Augustus can lay claim. He can do that in two ways, by being a member of the Julian family and tracing his descent to Aeneas and Venus, and also by virtue of the fact that his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, had been deified, had been turned into the divine Julius Caesar. So he's divine in two respects, and he would have an unusually long reign, 45 years, during which the entire Mediterranean was essentially under Roman control. And you see a portrait of Augustus that I excavated at Troy, where that same set of idealizing tendencies is easily visible. One of the things that is conveyed on this military cuirass, or breastplate, that he's wearing is the return of the Parthian standards. And let me just say a word about that. These wars between East and West that one reads about in the newspapers today, those go all the way back to the Trojan War, and they continued all the way through the 1st millennium BC and 1st millennium AD. So the Greeks fought the Persians, the Romans fought the Parthians being the successors of the Persians. And then the Byzantines would fight the Sasanians, who were the successors of the Parthians, and it just continues ad infinitum. But the Parthians were among the fiercest of the foes of the Romans. And the Parthians had a commanding victory over the Romans in what is now southeastern Turkey in the middle of the 1st century BC. They got the military standards of the Romans, their battle flags that they held on the battlefield. And it took the Romans over 30 years to get those standards back. But that's what you're seeing here, a Parthian handing over the standards to the personification of Rome. This was one of the foreign triumphs of which Augustus was proudest, in part because he was able to do it by diplomacy backed by force, not by actual battle. Now, as I say, by the end of the 1st century BC, as we're in the Augustan period, the entire Mediterranean basin is under Roman control. One of the last to fall was Egypt, which of course falls when Augustus is victorious over the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. And what we start seeing in the streets of Rome are big maps that show the extent of the Roman Empire. You could show the extent of the empire either through an actual cartographic map or by personifying in human form each component of the empire, each of the subjugated nations. And so we start seeing that too. I was lucky enough to excavate most of these at a site in southwestern Turkey called Aphrodisias. There was a whole parade of personifications, each of which represented one of the conquered regions for which Augustus and his predecessors had been responsible. And they're all fortunately labeled. Notice that all conquered personifications of regions, all conquered lands, are personified as women. And so you'll see here in the inscriptions, Ethnus Peruston, so the Yugoslavians have been conquered. The Dacians, modern-day Romania, have been conquered. The Bessi, the area of northern Greece and Bulgaria have been conquered. Crete has been conquered, and there were 50 of these in a big long line. That's one of the ways to advertise the extent of your empire. Personify all of the components and put them in a long line. And you also want to indicate that that enormous empire that you've just created will last forever. And if you want to do that with images, you can do it by personifying spatial and temporal personifications, or spatial and temporal concepts. So there were 50 of these directly above the conquered reliefs that we found. This is about 20 years ago. So you see one of them, Hemera, the day. There was also the evening star, the dawn, etc. These were temporal personifications, and then spatial personifications. The mountains, the ocean. This is the personification of the ocean that you see here. And the notion in including all these temporal and spatial personifications in this complex, as well as plenty of others that the Romans would build, was to signify that this dynasty, the dynasty of Augustus, was a dynasty that would have no spatial limits and no temporal limits. In other words, it would extend throughout the world, and it would last forever. If you want to do that with images, this is the easiest way to do it. I mentioned that Augustus was especially proud of the Parthian triumph. He was even prouder of the Egyptian triumph, and we see that Egyptian triumph commemorated in a variety of ways in central Rome. One of them was by personifying Egypt as a crocodile, sometimes just walking freely, sometimes on a leash tied to a palm tree, with the legend, Aegypto capta, Egypt has been subjugated by the Romans. And you would have been able to determine that subjugation, Rome's subjugation of Egypt, as you walked through the streets of Rome, because the city was now filled with obelisks that had been taken by Augustus from Egypt. And most of those are still on display in the city of Rome, although many of them were moved in the Renaissance by Pope Sixtus V. But here is one of the more famous ones. It began its life as an obelisk of the Egyptian pharaoh Psammetichus II, so about 600 BC, taken by Augustus from the Egyptian city of Heliopolis and used as the pointer for a gigantic sundial, or a gigantic clock, in a sense, in the middle of downtown Rome. You see that obelisk, which we would call a gnomon, a shadow caster, still on display in front of the Italian Parliament building. And if you look at the pavement around it, you can see that there are markings on the pavement that go hand in hand with the shadow that the obelisk casts. This we knew about, that there was an obelisk from Egypt that was the center of a monumental clock that Augustus had built in the late 1st century BC, but no parts of this clock had ever been found. We knew they were there, but they were under these buildings of the Campus Martius, which are among the most expensive real estate in Rome these days. And it took the Germans to excavate under those houses to actually find the pavement of the clock, which they did. So you're seeing the stone pavement into which these gilded bronze letters have been set, each of which is tied to a particular time of the year. So I'm giving you this vertiginous view down from the very top to the pavement. This is about 5 meters down before they reach the pavement. But it's on this pavement that that sundial would have cast its shadow. And you can see some inscriptions, Etesiae Pauontai, the Etesian winds stop. So that's a reference to late August, which is when these Etesian winds from North Africa stop. And you can see a Pi Alpha, PA, Parthenos or Virgo, so a reference to the zodiac. And here the end of Leo, or the lion, Leon. This Egyptian campaign, this Egyptian conquest, had the effect of making everyone crazy about Egyptian artifacts and memorabilia. In other words, there was a kind of Egyptomania that spread through Rome, a fascination for obelisks and pyramids and little figurines of Isis and Serapis and Anubis and Apis and their friends. And you see this repeatedly when a nation will conquer another region that's very different in material culture from the conqueror. So when Napoleon conquers Egypt around 1800, you find the same Egyptomania in Paris. During the war between America and Vietnam, the streets were flooded with East Asian symbols of religion. People began dressing as East Asian mystical figures. It's a common feature that you see during military campaigns, and Rome was no exception. So people start building tombs in downtown Rome in the shape of pyramids, one of which still survives, the Pyramid of Cestius, which is a marble pyramid right next to the gates of Rome. And there was another one near Vatican City. These, by the Renaissance, were regarded as tombs of Romulus and Remus. But in fact, they were simply tombs of wealthy Romans who were experiencing this Egyptomania fad. The dynasty that Augustus established, the so-called Giulio-Claudian dynasty, would last 100 years until the reign of Nero, the last of the Giulio-Claudians, from 54 to 68, so a 14-year period on the throne. Nero, whom you see here looking less than aesthetically pleasing, looking rather sinister, I think, at the beginning, remember, Nero wasn't very old. I mean, he's 17 years old when he gets to the throne. How many of us would have wanted to control the Roman Empire at 17? I know I would have had some trouble. And he had a very strong mother, Agrippina the Younger, whose portrait is upstairs in our Roman gallery. And she said to Nero, "Don't worry, I'll run the empire." She was a kind of Joan Crawford figure, you know, for those of you who are interested in cinema. And eventually Nero had her put to death. There are some very amusing stories about how that transpired. Nero invited her to a dinner party and afterwards sent her back to shore because it was a dinner party on an island, sent her back to shore in a boat that was rigged to collapse in the middle of the water while she was on it. But he wasn't counting on how strong a swimmer she was. And then he tried to poison her, but she was smart enough to take the antidotes for the poison before he gave it to her. And so then he just said, "You're an enemy of the state, I'm putting you to death," and away she went. After the major fire that swept through Rome during Nero's reign, you all know this expression, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. This was the fire of 64 AD. After that, Nero actually did some good things. There were new fire code regulations, streets, well, which is not bad. Streets were wider. There were porticos built along the streets with roofs that one could go up to and more effectively fight the fires. A limit placed on how high the wooden tenement houses could be because they were fire traps. But the fire swept away all of the buildings in central Rome, and Nero used that space to build a country villa for himself. Wasn't unusual for an emperor to have a country villa, but the country villas were in the country. They weren't in the middle of the city. And so suddenly there was what had been called a golden house, a domus aurea, that Nero built in the center of Rome with a colossal gilded statue of himself as the sun god. So over 100 feet high, gilded bronze with the features of Nero and the rays of the sun emanating from his head. It was called the Colossus, and therefore the arena that was set up next to the Colossus acquired the name Colosseum because it was the building set up next to the Colossus of Nero. It's hard for us to imagine what this statue of the Colossus of Nero must have been like. The closest we get in 20th century dictatorships is in Turkmenistan, in Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan, where until a few years ago, you could have seen the leader of Turkmenistan, a man named Turkmenbashi, represented in another gilded bronze colossal statue. He wasn't dressed as the sun god, but there was still a solar connection. It's motorized so that the sun always shines in the hand of Turkmenbashi. So as the sun moves across the sky, so too does Turkmenbashi. So that there's this link with the solar cult, as there had been with the Colossus of Nero, although in Nero's case, it's through the imposition of the solar crown on his head. This has now been taken down, needless to say. Nero committed suicide in 68, knowing that otherwise the torture to which he would have been subjected would have been catastrophic. and suicide was the easier way out. And then we move into a new dynasty altogether, one that rejects this idealization and the excesses of the Giulio-Claudian dynasty. This is more of a middle-class sort of farm mentality dynasty, initially founded by Vespasian, whom you see here on the left, and then continued by Titus and Domitian. And you see a colossal portrait of his son Titus here, whose arch many of you have seen in Rome. There was a deliberate move away from the portrait styles of the Giulio-Claudian period with this revival of the Republican veristic type, which I always compare to Lyndon Johnson. You know, it's the same sort of thing that you saw as you moved from the idealization of John Kennedy's portraits to the veristic style of Lyndon Johnson. It's the same sort of thing that you would have seen moving from the idealization of Augustus to the verism of Vespasian and the Flavians. And it's during this period that Nero's Golden House is wiped out, and in the place where Nero's Golden House had stood is built an arena, now called the Colosseum, for the benefit of the Roman people. And the wild animals that fought in this Colosseum may be referred to in the iconography of the Laud mosaic, which you'll see, of course, exhibited on the third floor. This was a building that could hold about 50,000 spectators, 45,000 seated and 5,000 standing, and there were contests that in some cases would go on for months at a time. So you would have animal fighting animal, human fighting human, and human fighting animal in the midst of landscape, which would be brought up from prop rooms, from set rooms, below the wooden floor of the Colosseum, so that you could evoke different parts of the world as you were staging these conflicts. And some of those landscape elements were intended to bring to the spectator's attention certain scenes from myth. So scenes of Oedipus, scenes of Pasiphae being raped by a bull on the shores of Crete. All different parts of the world could be evoked and recreated courtesy of all of the scenery. It's also during this period, just immediately prior to the completion of the Colosseum in Rome, 80 AD, we get the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the burial of Pompeii and Herculaneum 1 year earlier, 79 AD. And of course, we have our best understanding of Roman houses, Roman villas, Roman interior decoration from these houses in Pompeii and Herculaneum. And so we can look at the kinds of wall painting that is used in these houses and see that it's painted imitation of costly marbles. So what they were trying to do in a domestic setting was to imitate the kind of costly marble that was used for large public buildings and temples, such as the Pantheon that you see on the right, built for all the gods by Hadrian in the early 2nd century. And some of the schemes that make up the wall painting were influenced by actual architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, for example, you look at one of the Pompeian houses, and you see these ediculi, these canopied projections with half pediments, half gables, that flank a circular temple in the center. And then you can compare that to Petra in Jordan, which many of you have visited, where you'll see the same ediculi with half pediments flanking a circular temple or a circular element in the center. A number of these elaborate compositions, architectural monuments from the Eastern Mediterranean were prized by the Romans and evoked in 2 dimensions in the painted decoration of their villas. Just as the Giulio-Claudian dynasty had fallen with the excesses of Nero, the Flavian dynasty would fall with the excesses of Domitian in the late 1st century AD. And as with Nero, an order went out from the Senate to all of the colonies and municipalities of the empire, ordering that his name be erased from all public inscriptions and his image destroyed. And we, of course, have one of the more famous of the erasures of these public inscriptions of Domitian upstairs in the Roman gallery, the so-called Pozzuoli relief, where you can see the names, the titles of Domitian, line by line. We can reconstruct each of them, and you can see that each of them has been battered by the iconoclast, by the destroyer, upon receiving the news of the Senate. This was something that was relatively common in the Roman Empire, this system that we call damnatio memoriae. And then we move into a period of 5 good emperors. There had never been 5 good ones, one right after the other before. And they would occupy much of the 2nd century AD. So if you had to project yourself back into the past to a particular century of ancient Rome, if you wanted to go to one where there was relative peace and prosperity, the 2nd century would be the one to go to. It was during this period, the early 2nd century, that the empire reaches its greatest extent, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan, whom you see here in coinage and then in actuality. And you can see the extent of the empire reaching all the way into what is now Iraq. So Ctesiphon is in the outskirts of Baghdad. So all the way to the Persian Gulf. This is all part of Rome now, all through Armenia into what is the former Soviet Union, all of it under Rome. And Trajan commemorated many of these conquests in the decoration of his forum in central Rome, the most prominent element of which is this elaborate column of marble, 100 feet high, that was originally topped by a statue of Trajan, and that contains reliefs around the exterior of the column celebrating his victories in Dacia, modern-day Romania. It's in the base of the column that Trajan was buried, the only one of the Roman emperors to have been buried within the city walls. Normally, everyone was buried outside. You see here the columns of the Basilica of his Forum and the column of Trajan itself as it now exists. You have to imagine Trajan turned the other way originally, a bronze statue, but turned the other way, looking out over his Forum. In the early Christian period, they took down the statue of Trajan, put up one of St. Peter, and turned it around so that he was facing toward Vatican City, across the river. The iconography on this column is some of our most gruesome iconography of what battle was like in the early 2nd century AD. And so you see the severed heads of the Dacians. The heads of the Dacian enemy, the Romanian enemy, have been severed and are shown to Trajan as war trophies. And in some cases, the soldiers who have been given those heads as medals, in a sense, as monuments of triumph, as indicators of victory, don't have enough hands to fight and to carry the severed head at the same time. So this one has the severed head in its mouth. So he's holding onto the severed head as he's got the shield and the sword. I mean, images this graphic, this grotesque, we've seen more recently with the Taliban. And it's some of the most elaborate battle iconography that we have from the empire. Now, Rome would continue on through the 2nd century in a relatively stable situation. Once we reach the 3rd century, there would be more emperors than you could count. Almost every other day there was a new emperor. We call it the Age of Anxiety, where unemployment was high, inflation was high. The tribes were marshaling, tribes that were not friendly to Rome were marshaling along the borders and challenging the stability of those borders. So it was a very difficult period that would end only or would change with the stability of the late 3rd, early 4th century that Constantine and his predecessors would provide. You, of course, know the major monument of Constantine in downtown Rome, where you have elements from the earlier emperors who were judged to be great. So these circular reliefs are from a monument of Hadrian from the early 2nd century. These statues at the top are Dacians taken from the Forum of Trajan. These reliefs here are from the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century AD. It's as if Constantine and his designers sat down and said, who was good in the past? Let's take pieces of their monuments and stitch them all together as a way of indicating that I am the culmination of all the greatness of the earlier great emperors. And of course, it was during this period that there's the conversion from polytheism to Christianity and monotheism. So you see here a coin struck after Constantine's death that shows him in a chariot going up into the heavens and reaching out to the hand of the Christian God. And during this period, we see a change in religious architecture as well, because we're moving from polytheism to monotheism and from sacrifices outside a temple to religious activity inside a building. And so the basilica becomes the favored type for religious activities, and they will take the triumphal arch and incorporate that into the end of the basilica. So every basilica will now have a triumphal arch above the altar, now signifying not political triumph, but religious triumph. And it will be a standard feature until today of early Christian architecture. Rome will go east in the 4th century to Constantinople, again another innovation of Constantine, and there will be a kind of second Rome that will be founded. Constantine recognized that the empire was so complex that, and the east was such an unstable area, that the capital needed to be further to the east than it had been. And so you see Constantinople, or now Istanbul, here, located here at the juncture between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea, and all the great monuments of ancient Rome that were symbols of the power of Rome were taken by Constantine to Constantinople, including the archaic wooden statue of Athena that was reportedly brought to Rome from ancient Troy itself. And that empire, the Byzantine Empire, as I say, the second Rome, would last about 1,100 years until the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. And at that point, the second Rome is gone. It's now part of the new Ottoman Empire. And so the third Rome will be established. That is Moscow, because the niece of the last Byzantine emperor married the ruler of Russia. So Russia takes over the traditions of Rome and they begin to refer to themselves as the third Rome, saying that there will be no fourth Rome because Russia will never be destroyed. And it's at this point that there's a new title for the ruler of Russia, the Tsar, taken from the word Caesar, because they're the inheritors of all of these traditions, millennia old, that had been headquartered in the Byzantine Empire and that are now moving to Moscow. And of course, there would be an effort to revive the greatness of Republican and Imperial Rome in the early 20th century with the campaigns of Mussolini, whom you see here on the cover of the Sunday Courier in 1939, saluting his troops who were marching from the Colosseum, one of the great symbols of fascism, as it was of Imperial Rome, to the place where Mussolini is giving his speeches. And you also see these images now popping up all over Rome, figures carrying sticks that have been bundled together. This is a standard symbol of power in ancient Rome. We call it the fasces, sticks that are bundled together. You can see it all over buildings in Philadelphia, New York, all over the U.S., because Roman iconography has been such a prominent component of our monuments. And it was these fasces, the bundled sticks, that give the name to Mussolini's new political movement. They are the fascists because they carry the fasces, these bundled sticks of ancient Rome that symbolize such phenomenal power. And Mussolini does the same thing that the emperors did. He puts up giant maps of the extent of the empire along the main street leading to the Colosseum. These are still there, but set up by Mussolini as triumphal monuments. And he puts up his own obelisk, which has not been touched in spite of Mussolini's ultimate fate. So if you go to the Olympic Stadium in Rome, you'll see Mussolini is the leader, Mussolini Dux. Hasn't been touched, but the reason he sets up an obelisk is because he's positioning himself as a Roman emperor reborn. Saddam Hussein would do the same thing with the Babylonian kings. And it's about the time of Mussolini that Hollywood realizes they can use ancient Rome to sell concepts to the American people and to moviegoers all over the world. And so they start using Rome and Pompeii as components of what we would call proselytizing, showing that Christianity is really the way to go. So in all of these biblical spectacles, we call them sword and sandal films, bad things will befall the hero until he becomes Christian, and then he will get the girl. He will be martyred, but he will get the girl before he's martyred. And these were produced extensively by Hollywood as sort of religious proselytizing. And that continued on even during the Civil Rights Movement, where you get movies like Spartacus that are made right after Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. Hollywood isn't responding to the Civil Rights Movement by making movies about civil rights. They're doing it, but they're doing it through the lens of ancient Rome, showing slaves like Spartacus who were subjected to the same kind of humiliation as people of color in 20th century America. And of course, the ultimate component of Rome is a city, an empire, a concept of phenomenal wealth. Hence, Las Vegas taking over the notion of Rome as they took over the notion of Pompeii and using that as a symbol of ultimate luxury. So I hope you've gotten a sense of the multifaceted character of Rome as a consequence of this lecture. It's not just a city, it's a concept, and a concept that could be molded and reshaped by empires both east and west at will, which I suppose is one of the principal reasons why we refer to it as eternal. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for your support of the museum.